At the end of February 2023, the most important point on the front line was Bakhmut. Neither side was seriously considering peace. Yet on the very anniversary of the outbreak of the war, the world was abuzz with news that the Chinese had put forward what many at the time were calling a peace plan.
It was in fact a list of Chinese proposals on a way out of this conflict, without any concrete steps towards resolution or mediation. Chinese diplomat Li Hui was sent to various European capitals. He was in Moscow, and he also spoke with the Ukrainians. But in fact, in retrospect, you can see that it was mainly a PR and diplomatic exercise. The Chinese did not bring anything new in terms of the process itself. Well, also because neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians were interested in holding such talks. From the Chinese perspective, this fits in with their broader policy, specifically aimed at countries in the global south, at developing countries, where the Chinese have shown themselves to be peacemakers and mediators, those who do not encourage war. The important thing is that the actual content of what the Chinese proposed was, however, somehow in line with Russian goals. It called for an absolute cessation of hostilities, that is, a de facto freezing of the conflict as it stood at the time. This resolution would not have favored Ukraine, and indeed this was evident from the interactions between Kyiv and Beijing. When Li Hui went to Kyiv, instead of talking about the Chinese peace proposal, the Ukrainian presidential administration simply communicated to the Chinese what their ideas were for ending the war. And in fact, they did not even bring up the proposal in the talks.
On March 17, 2023, the president of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Piotr Hofmański, announces that the court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. They were accused of war crimes in Ukraine. This included the unlawful deportation and transfer of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. While of course the implementation of the warrant and thereof Putin's arrest at this point seems unrealistic, the ICC ruling was painful for the Kremlin in terms of PR. Several important figures in the Kremlin regime have commented on the issue of the arrest warrant, including Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, and Maria Zakharova, spokeswoman for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, downplaying the issue, saying that it doesn't matter, that this warrant cannot be enforced in any way. But on the other hand, they also threatened that if any of the countries which ratified the Rome Statutes wishes to enforce this order, it can expect severe consequences from Russia. So this element of fear, of psychological pressure, suggests that for the Russian establishment, this decision was indeed severe and very unfavorable in terms of public image. Russian propaganda responded to this in a very poignant way. Before the arrest warrant was issued, Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova very often appeared on Russian television, boasting how she was rescuing Ukrainian children, evacuating them deep into Russia, and how she was looking for foster families for these children in Russia. She herself also admitted that she had adopted one such child. After the arrest warrant was issued, the narrative disappeared from the Russian media. Instead, the material presented how Russians themselves, out of their own goodwill, send Ukrainian children back to Ukraine, how they search for their parents, and what a great deal of work they do in order to get these Ukrainian children back to their families, who are in Ukraine. When it was reported in the Russian media that the Russian MP and his wife had traveled to the occupied territories, and from there brought one of the Ukrainian children for adoption, this information did not appear widely in the Russian media at all. So we can see that from the PR point of view, this is unfavorable information for the Kremlin, because it suggests that Putin is a toxic figure internationally, that he is a criminal, that he is wanted, and therefore any talks or negotiations or diplomatic contacts with him will not be possible in the future. Russia was not achieving significant successes on the front line, so they pull out their old boogeyman, nuclear weapons. They have already raised the state of readiness of their nuclear forces, held nuclear weapons exercises, and moved missiles. All this to raise tensions and stoke fear. And so it was this time. On March 25th, Vladimir Putin announces that Russian nuclear weapons will be dispatched to Belarus.
Białoruś była też pewnym takim gestem rosyjskim.
Belarus was also a kind of Russian gesture, when Russia showed that it was prepared to take certain actions which do not directly change the strategic balance, but which nevertheless create certain operational risks for NATO neighboring states, and which shows that these Russian nuclear threats are, in a sense, credible. It is also indirectly a response to a discussion that Russia has been highly critical of, regarding the potential expansion of the nuclear sharing policy within NATO. In short, the placement of US tactical nuclear weapons on the territories of European NATO members.
As in the previous year, deliveries from the West were crucial for Ukrainians. On April 19, 2023, a new type of armament arrives in Ukraine, the Patriot air defense systems.
To był bardzo ważny symbol.
This was a very important symbol of the West supporting Ukraine. Patriots are the most modern and technologically advanced weapon that has been provided by the West. It is difficult to imagine that, in the foreseeable future, anything could surpass the Patriots in this respect.
In addition to the symbolic meaning, its military significance was equally important. The Patriots were meant to be the anti-aircraft defense of Kyiv and the surrounding areas, as well as other locations such as Odessa.
Tym, co przyniosły patrioty, było względne.
The most important thing that the Patriots brought was the relative, and I'll underline this, the relative assurance of calm, or the sense of calm, to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, which at the moment is in general perceived as a city that can counter the threat of an attack by various types of aerial assault. This is not quite the case because Russian missiles penetrate this screen, despite the presence of the Patriots. However, because of the current targets, there is no longer this relative pressure of the Russians to attack mainly the kind of targets that are important in terms of running an operation, rather than simply destroying cities, as it was in the beginning. In the first weeks of the war, when Russians were near Kyiv, they were using rocket artillery that hit residential buildings. Today, I would say that the greater threat to the people of Kyiv at the moment is the falling debris of interceptor missiles that are launched to shoot down incoming Russian missiles than the Russian missiles themselves.
It is the night of May 3rd. Shocking news of explosions in the Kremlin make waves worldwide. These images follow shortly after. The explosion quickly proved not to be dangerous, with Vladimir Putin not present in the Kremlin buildings at the time. This situation was just one example of drone attacks on Moscow.
Te ataki dronów, które uderzały w centrum Moskwy.
Those drone attacks that hit Russian facilities in the center of Moscow, in these cities, whether they fell in the vicinity of Moscow, including flying over the Rubliov highway and over the homes of Russian oligarchs, primarily had a psychological function. They were intended to show the Russian public that there was a real war going on, and that they could not feel safe anywhere, that what the authorities, what the Kremlin, what Russian propaganda tells them is not true, that it's just a case of the Russian armed forces on the territory of Ukraine doing their tasks in the so-called special military operation, and that in fact all of Russia is involved in the war and everyone can witness its outcomes and therefore cannot feel safe. So in this sense, it had an important role, because it destroyed a foundation of Russian propaganda directed at its own Russian citizens.
While the drone attacks in Moscow were a difficult subject for Russian propaganda, success soon followed. Yevgeny Prigozhin announces the Wagner Group has seized Bakhmut.
To dla obu stron był przede wszystkim symbol.
For both sides, it was primarily a symbol. The one who had Bakhmut had the upper hand in these prolonged positional battles. Bakhmut, as a nodal city in the northeastern part of the Donetsk region, opened the Russians, or initially closed and later opened the way for the Russians further west towards the administrative center of the Ukrainian-controlled part of the Donetsk region, that is, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Without capturing Bakhmut, this advance further in the direction of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk would have been much more difficult. You could, of course, go around it to try to operate from other directions through the Kharkiv Oblast, from the southwestern part of the Donetsk region, but there the situation was not at all better. This Ukrainian-controlled center of the region was closest to reach from Bakhmut, but Bakhmut alone does not yet solve the problem for the Russians. It certainly improves their tactical situation, but the Russians have to reach and cross the Donetsk-Donbass Canal, which largely runs underground and does not constitute a substantial obstacle in the terrain. Right before it, there is undulating mountainous terrain, which is inconvenient for the movements of troops. So the seizure of Bakhmut alone is not the only thing the Russians need to continue their march towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. They need Bakhmut and a bit more, those several kilometers west of it up to the canal.
The significance of Bakhmut was therefore mainly in propaganda terms. And indeed, the Russian media turned it into a celebration. We see this even here when Vladimir Solovyov, a Russian TV presenter and propagandist, triumphantly brought the Bakhmut coat of arms into the television studio.
И наши ребята герои молодцы. Просто герои, просто молодцы. У нас должна быть фотография, я вам покажу, где мы это сняли, где мы это взяли. Вот как раз город Бахмут, въезд. И там мы взяли герб Бахмута.
I oczywiście rosyjska propaganda zrobiła z tego ogromne zwycięstwo.
Of course, Russian propaganda made this into a huge victory, absolutely disproportionate to what happened. They showed the city, saying that it was destroyed by Ukrainian forces, absolutely ignoring Russian culpability. Generally speaking, in Russian propaganda, everything bad that happened in Ukraine, what has happened on the front, is of course the fault of Ukraine and the West, while the Russians are doing only good things there. So indeed, the capture of Bakhmut was a big celebration in Russian propaganda. May saw further propaganda problems for Russians. Two sabotage and reconnaissance groups consisting of Russians but fighting on the side of Ukraine entered several villages in the Belgorod region on Russian territory.
Od razu na wstępie podkreślę, że to ma duży wymiar.
Let me emphasize right at the outset that this has a large propaganda dimension, that the Russians are fighting against Putin's regime. The question of their influence on military action at present, let's be blunt, is not substantial. This is actually a token activity. In May last year, there was a spectacular raid on the territory of Belgorod Oblast, where a Russian volunteer corps occupied several villages, made a lot of commotion. For the first time, Russians understood that among the Ukrainians, among those supporting the Ukrainian troops, there are Russians. This is a certain political problem for the Russians, and the Russian government muted the issue, that it was Russians who did this. There were hopes that the activities of these Russian volunteer formations, which I emphasize, are under the control of Ukrainian military intelligence that plans these operations for them and allows them to do something. They do not act independently. They are not some warlords who went to Ukraine and gained an autonomous position there. They are part of the Ukrainian defense system, and their activities raise some hope that maybe the Russian public, for example in the Belgorod region, will realize that there are Russians who are fighting against Putin, that it would change something politically, even on this micro scale. That did not succeed. These formations are still active. There is information that they did something, but it continues to be partisan reconnaissance. None of it was very spectacular. Only the fact that there are Russians who hate Putin to such an extent that they are willing to fight the Russian army.
On June 4th, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that had been announced and postponed for many weeks began. The Ukrainians struck the southern section of the front towards Melitopol. Why there? Because it was the shortest possible route to cut off Russia's connection to Crimea.
Można powiedzieć, jaki wskazać cele.
If we were to indicate the objective, then we saw the directions of impact. Just this on the border, actually in Donetsk Oblast, bordering on the Zaporizhia Oblast, and coinciding with it, that is, south of Velika Novosilka. On the other hand, Zaporizhia, Orikhiv, and further south. In both cases, one element linking these directions of offensive were Berdyansk and Melitopol. In both cases, this was the shortest route, and also Berdyansk and Melitopol are quite important from the point of view of Russian logistics in the area. Cutting this corridor and seizing these cities would make it more difficult for the Russians to continue their operations, and also, in the event of continued offensive actions by Ukraine, to defend Crimea. Especially taking into account that with Ukrainian forces approaching the borders of the Sea of Azov, the Crimean Bridge would be within their attack range, within the range of their HIMARS, and then its fate would be a foregone conclusion.
2 days later, the Russians blow up the dam at Nova Kakhovka. This causes a major flood. With this, the Russians removed the Ukrainians from their positions on the lower Dnipro River. This likely prevented their plans for landing on the other side of the river.
Operacja ta prawdopodobnie miała być w planach ukraińskich skorelowana z
And this operation was probably intended to be correlated in Ukrainian plans with an attack on the Zaporizhia front. Such a planned operation would allow the Ukrainians to significantly break up the Russian grouping, to draw off large forces in the Kherson Oblast. On the other hand, on account of the flood which the Russians caused, at least for several weeks until the water subsided, they were covered from this side and were able to move some forces from the lower Dnipro to the Zaporizhia front. First and foremost, it was about the 7th Air Assault Division, which played a very important role in July and August 2023 during countering the Ukrainian attacks in the areas of Robotyna and Verbove.
However, there were not only military consequences when the dam was blown up, there were also ecological ones.
O katastrofie ekologicznej można mówić przede wszystkim w odniesieniu do
We can call it an environmental catastrophe when it comes to the areas above the dam, that is, to the former Kachowka reservoir. With such a rapid flow of water, it resulted in the death of millions of animals, fish and mollusks. Their remains began to simply decompose. After the destruction of the dam and after most of the water from the reservoir had flowed out, many people began to fear that the reservoir would dry up and that there would be dust storms that would in turn lift up the toxic substances that have for several decades been accumulating on the bottom of the reservoir. These substances were carried by water from industrial centers in major cities located along the entire Dnipro River. Luckily, this did not happen because the destruction of the dam and the drainage of the water took place in early June. It was still the time of vegetation and seeds, especially of willows and poplar trees native to the area. They managed to germinate and grew very quickly. And in fact, within a few weeks, a few months after this disaster, the revival of this great area of meadow, riparian forests and wetlands took off. They were there before the construction of the dam in the 1950s. Because this disaster occurred in the spring, paradoxically, it contributed to the rebuilding of an ecosystem that closely resembled the natural one. If the Russians had blown up the dam a few months later, the ecological impact could have been much more serious. While the prolonged decomposition of animal remains did poison the soil, it seems that nature has dealt with it on its own. Right now, the epidemiological situation there seems under control, and it's no longer a great catastrophe.
At the time, there was increasing talk of Prigozhin in Russia, especially when the Wagner Group announced the capture of Bakhmut.
Tygodniach, w miesiącach poprzedzających pucz Prigozzyna
In the weeks and months preceding Prigozhin's mutiny, a lot was said about him in the Russian media, portraying him as a hero. There were even comparisons in the propaganda that Yevgeny Prigozhin, together with Ramzan Kadyrov, are the new Minin and Pożarski in modern Russia, meaning figures who will lead a nationwide uprising directed against the West, against the hostile forces that want to annihilate Russia. So Prigozhin was presented as a hero who emerged from the people, a defender and a fearless warrior, and so on. He had a very positive image in the Russian media. The propaganda changed its approach to Prigozhin not long afterwards, but to tell the story, we need to go back to April and May 2023. Yevgeny Prigozhin publishes a video in which, in vulgar terms, he criticizes Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov. He also insults the Russian elite.
Shoigu! Gerasimov! Где боеприпасы?
Prigozhin begins his blackmail that if he does not receive more ammunition, he will withdraw from Bakhmut. This film, but also Prigozhin's subsequent videos, turn out to be a prelude to a revolt.
Prigozhin był przekonany, że jest osobą wyjątkową.
Prigozhin was convinced that he was already an exception within all of Russia, that he managed his armed troops as he pleased, that he acted independently and had begun to lecture the army. First, he began to criticize the Russian Supreme Command for the lack of logistical support, for the lack of timely delivery of ammunition, and so on and so forth. And he did it publicly. At one point, he demanded the dismissal of the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff. Tensions within Russia were rising. He was the only person that criticized the top military leadership in this way. He didn't criticize Putin, only Gerasimov and Shoigu, for their incompetence, for badly managing the war. It was clear that he was so convinced of his own greatness that he had already crossed some red lines, which made the political situation very difficult for the Kremlin.
The conflict between Prigozhin and the leadership of the Ministry of Defense deepens. On June 10th, Defense Minister Shoigu obliges members of the volunteer formations, including the Wagner Group, to sign a contract with the Defense Ministry. In doing so, Shoigu wanted to subordinate Prigozhin's mercenaries. The Wagnerians refused to accept this, and the army began preparations to take away their heavy equipment. Prigozhin realized what was happening, that he would soon be left without equipment and ammunition. so he decides to risk everything. On the evening of June 23rd, he accuses the Russian armed forces of carrying out a rocket and artillery attack on a Wagner training camp. He announces the start of what he calls the March for Justice, to punish those responsible. On the night of June 23rd to 24th, the mobilization of enforcement structures begins in Moscow and the Rostov region. The main access roads to Rostov-on-Don are blocked. The first TV channel broadcasts a special edition of news with messages condemning Prigozhin, and key commanders publish their statements. Fear and information chaos reign in Russia that night, as the country faces a major crisis. During the night, Prigozhin and his mercenaries enter Rostov-on-Don and occupy the Southern Military District Command building without facing resistance, a building where the generals of the Russian army are stationed.
To było za duże zaskoczenie, ponieważ
That was the big surprise. No one wanted to counter Prigozhin's actions, and I can't imagine how the atmosphere he created and what he himself said could somehow not raise concern among the FSB, the military counterintelligence, or even Kremlin politicians.
To, co się wydarzyło, wstrząsnęło Rosją wówczas, było pewnym szokiem.
What happened shook Russia at the time. It was somewhat of a shock to the Russian elite above all, because it showed the fragility of this regime and the fragility of the support for it. The ease with which Prigozhin's forces seized an important Russian command in Rostov-on-Don and the public reaction to it, the benevolent neutrality of the Russians towards the revolt, and even some signs of being in favor of it. And there were some signs of, well, if not panic, then at least of uncertainty among the elite. The fact that only some of the governors spoke unequivocally in support of the Kremlin, and those defensive preparations that were being made around Moscow when Prigozhin began his march on Moscow, showed in fact that this Kremlin thesis about the unity of the nation and such mass support for the Kremlin, for Putin, is not true.
On June 24th, Prigozhin continues his march towards Moscow. The capital is preparing to defend itself. Prigozhin emphasizes that his aim is not to overthrow Putin, but to dismiss key military officers and the defense minister. The progress of his troops is being followed globally. But at one point, at about 200 kilometers from the capital, Wagner's group stops.
dzieje się coś ciekawego, bo to jest do dzisiaj niewyjaśnione, w jaki sposób...
Something interesting happens, and it remains unexplained to this day how Prigozhin was stopped. On the one hand, I believe that Prigozhin himself was not interested in Russian bloodshed. He rather avoids shooting, giving the order, or permitting Wagner troops to shoot at Russian soldiers who, for example, would be waiting on the outskirts of Moscow. On the other hand, it must have been only then that some apparatus was launched. They began to think what to do with him and began searching for a scenario to stop Prigozhin. And this indeed happens, just like we officially saw it. It was the initiative, rather the help, of Lukashenko, who called Prigozhin and convinced him to head to Belarus, that he would receive him there, he would host him, that he had received a guarantee from the Russian government that they would leave him alone in Belarus.
And indeed, in accordance with the agreement with Lukashenko, some of the Wagnerians moved to Belarus.
Prigozhin znajduje się na Białorusi, ale...
Prigozhin is in Belarus, but the story continues. He very soon begins to travel to Russia, to St. Petersburg, to Moscow. He is present at a meeting between Putin and the commanders of Wagner field troops. And there is a situation there when Putin asks who wants to sign the contract. Prigozhin answered that not everyone wants to, and as it turned out, most were against it. This was the beginning of the breakup of the so-called Wagner group. Prigozhin was trying to save his business because let's remember that the Wagnerites were one thing, but Prigozhin also had quite a diversified business in Russia. Among other things, he was making a fortune in supplying food to the military. He was the owner of the Concord Company Group, and this lingered. Wagner groups began to disappear from Belarus. As it turned out, well, some just didn't see the point of staying there, and if they wanted to, they signed these contracts with the army. What was interesting is that the Prigozhin mutiny did not influence the presence of Wagner troops in Africa. There, in some African countries, there are and will continue to be Wagner soldiers, but under the control of the defense ministry. Some went to Russia, some went to Africa, and actually the issue of the Wagner Group was dissolved. They gave up all their heavy weapons and equipment, and they dispersed in different directions. And they are still around, of course, but no longer under that name.
The final act of the Wagner case takes place on August 23rd, when Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, alias Wagner, are killed in a mysterious plane crash.
Wszystko wskazuje na to, że to był zamach bombowy.
Everything suggests he was killed by a bomb. We know the investigation didn't reveal anything. Putin, with his peculiar sense of humor, informed the whole nation that they'd been playing with grenades on board, and one exploded.
To było z kolei sygnałem, że Kreml poczuł...
This was a sign that the Kremlin already felt strong. It was confident enough that the investigation it had launched didn't uncover any networks of a conspiracy as they'd feared, and they were able to make a surgical strike to decapitate the leadership of the Wagner Group to neutralize any potential threat it posed. And in a way that strengthens the Kremlin and the stability of the regime. But we still remember that these June events have not been entirely forgotten, so the stability of this system remains fragile.
The internal situation in Ukraine dominated the picture in early September. On September 2nd, oligarch Igor Kolomoisky was arrested. The detention of such an important oligarch was an unprecedented event in Ukraine's recent history. On September 4th, Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov is dismissed. His resignation had already been expected for many weeks. It was motivated by the numerous corruption scandals surrounding the ministry. Very important events for Ukraine were also taking place on the other side of the globe. On the 1st of October, the US Congress adopts a provisional budget. However, it does not include the $24 billion aid package for Ukraine, sought out by the White House. Already since the fall, the Biden administration has increasingly restricted the transfer of ammunition and military equipment to Ukraine. In 2024, such deliveries have been almost non-existent. This was reflected in the situation of the Ukrainian armed forces on the front, and the restrictions on the use of artillery ammunition in particular. Throughout the summer and autumn months, the Ukrainian counteroffensive continued. However, it did not bring any major successes. As a result, on November 1st, 2023, Ukrainian military commander-in-chief General Zaluzhny, in an article for The Economist, admits that it ended in failure.
Ukraińcy, co też wyszło...
The Ukrainians admitted later that they were too gung-ho at the start of operations. The Ukrainian army was not prepared for this kind of operation, not in terms of the accumulated forces and resources, and not in terms of the preparation of the soldiers. In fact, it was in large part driven by politics. The Ukrainian army, or more precisely Ukraine, needed the offensive not just for military reasons. For military reasons, they should have delayed it a little, probably in order to prepare more arms and military equipment, to train the soldiers better. They'd been trained in the West to use Western-supplied weapons in the fastest time possible, and this provided no guarantees that these soldiers were well prepared. And they were not well prepared in how to use them, as was seen repeatedly in battle conditions. There was a problem with something. From December 2022, at first Ukraine's military intelligence and later President Zelensky's team, they drove the full support for the military to raise the morale of Ukrainians by talking about the coming Ukrainian spring counteroffensive and recapturing the occupied territories. And in the general message, it was presented that it would be like outside Kharkiv in September 2022. But it needs to be remembered that in September 2022, Ukraine was successful when it attacked unfortified Russian positions in secondary or tertiary units that were shielding the flanks. The Russians simply had not secured their flanks from the direction of Kharkiv Oblast, and they suffered the consequences. The Russians there were absolutely unprepared to defend, and the Ukrainian forces entered like a hot knife through butter and very quickly dispersed the Russians. The Russians were only taking losses and soon decided to evacuate from the Kharkiv Oblast, and they prepared a new line of defense on the border of Kharkiv Oblast and Luhansk Oblast. Everybody on the Ukrainian side counted on the fact that, as in precisely the same situation, once the Russians see the Ukrainians with Leopards, when they see them with HIMARS and a lot of Western arms, and when they see determined, Western-trained Ukrainian soldiers, that they will only have to stamp their feet and the Russians would run away. And that didn't happen. The Russians had spent many months preparing their extended lines and defensive positions in the direction of Ukrainian strikes. To the south of Orikhiv, there were 3 large defensive Russian lines prepared in various positions. It wasn't a case that single positions were fortified and when broken it moved on. It was the case that right after one fortified position, there was another, and then another. On the route that Ukraine chose, there were dozens of those fortified positions. And the Russians had also learned from their mistakes. They are in fact soldiers, and they know what they're doing, and they do what they can to try to counteract. And it turned out here that, yes, at the beginning of the war, Russians had made a serious mistake. Their original sin had been to underestimate their opponent during the first phase of the war. They had underestimated the Ukrainians and the support the West was providing for Ukraine. But Ukraine also underestimated their opponent. By beginning the offensive in June, it was the end of spring. They should have started in April, but the Western equipment hadn't arrived, at least not everything that Ukraine had been counting on when starting the offensive. So Ukraine made a similar mistake in underestimating Russia.
As a result, there was little change on the front line. This map shows the state before the start of the counteroffensive, and this is what it looked like on November 1st. The changes were no greater than 10 kilometers. According to the Ukrainians themselves, they managed to regain between 250 and 300 square kilometers in all directions. They achieved no operational success and only a few tactical successes, taking about 7 to 8 villages. Positive news for Ukraine, however, comes on November 8th. The European Commission recommends to the European Council to start accession negotiations with Ukraine.
Rozpoczęcie negocjacji akcesyjnych z Ukrainą jest
Opening accession negotiations with Ukraine is a great success for Ukraine's society and government. When the war is not going as Ukraine would like, it's a rare success which may serve as a clear signal, which can dispel the darkness of war. I think Ukrainians did not completely expect that the process would move so quickly. It's worth noting that the Ukrainian government submitted the request to join a few days after the start of the war. In June 2022, the European Union granted Ukraine candidate status and finally opened negotiations at the end of 2023. To be precise, the decision was made to start negotiations. So these are all big successes. But on the other hand, there is the impression that the Ukrainian government and society are looking at the expected length of the negotiations rather unrealistically, expecting that it will come sooner rather than later. It won't be like that. These negotiations will be tough. Even before the actual negotiations, we can see how the situation is. It's already difficult, so there's no doubt that although Ukraine has started the process after many years of seeking access, it has received promises that it will one day be a member of the EU. Well, the stress here is on one day, and that one day will be in many years.
On December 1st, Vladimir Putin signs a decree increasing the size of the Russian armed forces to 1,320,000 military personnel. The number of full-time military personnel is increased by almost 170,000. This is just one symptom of the transition of the entire Russian state to a war footing.
Cała Rosja funkcjonuje tak naprawdę w trybie stanu wojny.
The whole of Russia is genuinely on a war footing. Although the government constantly tries to portray this war of aggression as a limited conflict, the entire Russian economy is largely organized to assist the war. This is visible not just in the budget costs. Nominal defense expenditure has tripled in Russia in 3 years. At present, it's nominally 30% of the budget. We estimate that 40% of budget expenditure in Russia at the moment is linked to objectives connected to the war in Ukraine. This is a large burden and will certainly have an impact on the economy. The economy is suffering, to say the least, from a labor shortage. There are over 1.2 million vacancies. Besides the demographic problems, there are the war losses, which are quite serious and are having a negative impact on the Russian economy. But this doesn't change the fact that the priority is Russia's arms industry. All of Russia's arms factories are working with 3 shifts, and their capacity is being systematically extended. And all of Russia's actions, including those to circumvent sanctions, are in large part aimed at supplying the armed forces with the required components.
In late 2023 and early 2024, the largest missile attacks on Ukraine since the start of the war took place. However, what made them stand out was not only the scale of the Russian actions.
Zmieniły się przede wszystkim cele.
Above all, the objective of these attacks has changed, not their nature. At the start of the second year of war, Russia tried to destroy Ukraine's energy industry during winter, and thus to make people's lives harder and the functioning of the state. But it didn't have a big result, despite certainly making life hard for Ukrainians. In the autumn of 2023, they renewed the large-scale rocket and drone attacks, aimed mainly at destroying military targets which could be directly working for Ukraine's war effort deep within the country, so ammunition depots and various supplies, and places producing components or assembling components received from the West, from the Ukrainian arms industry, or just the maintenance for the front line. Because the first maintenance of the most important arms and military equipment which Ukrainians use takes place in Ukraine as part of the really large industrial base which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet military-industrial complex. So in terms of area where things are produced in Ukraine, as in the whole Soviet Union, there is a lot of them, and it's not possible to destroy everything quickly.
On February 8, 2024, President Zelensky dismissed the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny had been increasingly popular in recent months and had spoken directly about the needs of the army. This is just one symptom that politics has returned to Ukraine.
Ona zresztą wróciła nie tyle w ostatnich miesiącach, mam wrażenie, że
I wouldn't say it returned in recent months. I have the impression that it had been gradually returning for over a year. But it's obviously a matter of scale and the extent to which this politics is penetrating the public sphere. There is some self-censorship by journalists and self-censorship by politicians. I have the impression that in the first months there was a great concentration on showing this consolidation, that we're all together, that we have a common enemy, that we're suspending our political conflicts. Nevertheless, as the war's gone on, and assuming it'll be a long war, these things are returning and being seen. The clearest, most visible one, especially in the media, is the tension between President Zelensky and the Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny. Here there was a kind of turning point, the 1st of November, and General Zaluzhny's famous article for The Economist, in which Zaluzhny's comments somehow ran counter to Zelensky's statements, to the political message from the President's office, which was more optimistic. Zaluzhny was more practical, more sober. He said in the interview that the counter-offensive had failed, and that we were moving into a positional war, and that in order to win, we need a technological breakthrough. And this is when we began to see different tensions between them. Zelensky was quite critical about Zaluzhny's statements. He directly told him, "You're either dealing with war, or you're dealing with politics." Staff at the President's office also openly criticized Zaluzhny, and politicians from the parliament also did it.
Another point of contention was the proposal for a mobilization law. Zaluzhny directly communicated the needs of the army and said that he needed a few 100,000 soldiers.
No ale to jest problem polityczny, tak? To jest niepopularne.
But this is a political problem. It's unpopular, especially if, and we know what the situation at the front in the army is like, especially if there's corruption, unequal treatment. People don't want to join the army. We clearly see that they're not in the same place they were in the first weeks or months. And Zaluzhny says openly that he needs hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it's up to you, the politicians, how to get it done. That's your problem, because it's a political issue. You have to pass laws, rules and regulations, but it's my job to wage the war, and I need the tools for that.
One of the most experienced Ukrainian commanders, General Syrsky, became the new commander-in-chief. It is not only Zaluzhny who has left his post. The changes in the army are more extensive.
Jeśli chodzi o działania wojenne w tym trudnym
In terms of warfare, in a difficult 2024, I have the impression that the dismissal of Zaluzhny and his replacement with General Syrsky and a host of other Ukrainian leaders, this won't make much difference because the Ukrainian army and Ukraine itself have much more serious problems. Above all, the lack of ammunition, the lack of materiel, the lack of soldiers, some organizational chaos in the supply base. It's these things which will really determine Ukraine's fate in 2024 and its success at the front. If there's more ammunition, more arms, if there's financial and military support from the West, if this is not just continued but increased, then this will decide the situation at the front. Plus, of course, a well-managed mobilization. In my opinion, the staffing issues are of secondary importance.
One of the points of contention mentioned between Zaluzhny and Zelensky was the issue of mobilization. Overall, the personnel problems of the Ukrainian army were increasingly evident in 2023.
Masa ochotników, która wstąpiła do wojska w 2022 roku, liczy na...
The large number of volunteers who joined the army in 2022, counted in the hundreds of thousands, began to disappear. There were casualties. Some of them were killed, some were injured. Some got ill, or there were family reasons for them to leave the army. And those soldiers who fought at the beginning of the war, above all the professional army from before the 24th of February 2022, and the volunteers at the start of the war, these people who've served at the front for 2 years are very tired and are physically and psychologically burnt out. Very often they need to rest, to be rotated. And the third element, which is becoming more keenly felt, is the high average age of the soldiers in the Ukrainian army. It's over 40. This leads to health problems, a poor physical condition, a lower tolerance for the difficulties of action in the field. This above all concerns the infantry, because a 40-year-old or 50-year-old who's a good specialist or a good technician, serves in the maintenance division or maybe as tank crew, is not as difficult to service as in the infantry. In the first line, there are posts where they have to spend several days sitting in a trench without food or sleep, with limited rest, often up to their knees in mud, in the frost, and so on. Serving in the infantry, especially during positional warfare, needs very good health, a good physical condition, and this is getting worse. Across the whole front, there is a non-negligible shortage of men, to the point that some companies are manned at levels below 50%. Often a company might have 40 to 50 soldiers. In other words, they've dropped to the level of a platoon, and more commanding officers are complaining about the shortage of men. If we talk about the level at the end of 2023, it seems that the shortage of men was a bigger problem than the weapons and ammunition shortage. In the coming weeks and months, there could be a big problem with ammunition, so the Ukrainian army is in a big crisis, which could get worse. The way out of the situation is to change the rules for mobilizing soldiers and a reform in the military replenishment system, which, despite some changes, is still an ineffective structure. It's full of red tape. We more often hear accusations of corruption. It was worst in the middle of 2023. Now it seems that it has at least partly been put under control. However, the army will need a new mobilization bill in a new legal framework. Above all, the launch of a digital register of men subject to compulsory mobilization. And unfortunately, this bill has for a long time not been passed by the Verkhovna Rada. Due to political reasons, President Zelensky doesn't want to be responsible for that bill. In December and January, responsibility for the bill was passed around various centers of power, civil and military. It's a big problem. At the moment, we're waiting. It was predicted that it will be passed by the Verkhovna Rada at the end of February, and in February or March it should be signed by the President. Will that happen? We will see.
Looking back, we can say that it was a year of positional warfare, straight out of the First World War.
Jeżeli chodzi o wszelkie prowadzone akcje przez obie strony.
As for all actions undertaken by both sides, references to the First World War on the Western Front are absolutely justified. All the more so because all the offensive actions, such as the Ukrainian offensive, i.e. the main military event of the second year of the war, all these actions have seen gains of several kilometers, just like the French and German offensives on the Western Front in the First World War. This precisely is the domain of positional warfare, especially in deeply fortified defences. It's hard for one side or the other to break through a fortified position at the moment, especially because both sides know everything about each other at the tactical level and cannot surprise each other. On the operational level, especially if larger groups have been prepared, which show the opponents that they'd like to make a breakthrough in a given section on one side or the other, then the opponent can see that straight away. Neither side can uncover anything here. Regarding a kind of surprise, this could only happen on a very low level, perhaps in battles within a town. People defending a building or a part of town can surprise their opponent if they got to another part of town relatively quietly. These are exceptional situations. Both sides know everything about each other perfectly well. If they move to attack, the other side sees everything. This may not have the hallmark of positional warfare in a strict sense, but it's typical positional warfare, and we also see elements typical of military action which we can honestly say are pre-industrial, when there are those soldiers who've seen each other and know they are going to shoot at each other.
In recounting another year of the war, we must not forget about Belarus.
Choć wojska rosyjskie już nie wykorzystują terytorium Białorusi do prowadzenia działań.
Although the Russian military no longer uses Belarusian territory for military activity, Minsk remains Russia's closest ally in supporting it in the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. The second year of the war led to Belarus 100% returning to Russia's military territory. For years, a decade, Lukashenko had claimed that Belarus is a neutral country, a country with no nuclear weapons. This was crossed out when Lukashenko and Putin jointly, that's how it was presented, jointly decided that, not due to the threat from Ukraine, but because of the threat from NATO and the expansion of the potential of the eastern flank, they were forced, due to the hostile actions of the West, to bring tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. The Belarusian army had received some Iskanders, which could carry nuclear warheads. I won't say with full accountability that these tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus are physically there, because yes, there was an agreement, but later there was information, of course very sparse, that well, yes, but it hasn't been transported yet, because we haven't completed the construction of the storage facilities. I could assume that they are, but also that they aren't. They can be transported there at any given time. This is about a gesture of great political importance, that Belarus can no longer break away from Russia in security matters. Lukashenko, of course, says that he will co-determine the use of these weapons and so on and so forth. This is not true. This is decided by the Russians, not the Belarusians. This does not mean that Lukashenko has received a gift from Putin and may, God forbid, use these tactical nuclear weapons on his own. Another point is that since the beginning of the conflict, that is, since the beginning of the war, they have met 24 times, I think. It's not clear what they talk about, but they are meeting. Well, mainly about the integration of the federal state, because this process is supposed to be completed in 2026. But surely they are also talking about things they don't want to disclose, and here I suspect that the Belarus arms industry is being engaged to help the Russians. Recently there was information that a plane from China landed in Minsk with some cargo which has not been identified. But I can also suspect that first of all Lukashenko mentioned that Belarus will undertake the mass production of drones. And this is the kind of equipment that is relatively easy to produce, and Russia needs it. Belarus supports Russia providing supplies of processed fuel and of course ammunition, which it still might have. I do not know what the current state is, but the Defense Ministry of Belarus during talks with Iran once planned the purchase of a closed production line of artillery munitions. I do not know if this has happened, because this is a typical leak, but it is clear that Belarus is taking as much as it can from this, of course, including financial support from Russia, and so it continues to provide its support.
If we look to the future of the war, the ongoing debate in the US on support for Ukraine is extremely important.
Jeżeli pakiet wsparcia dla Ukrainy nie przejdzie w Izbie Reprezentantów,
if such support for Ukraine does not pass in the House of Representatives and more broadly in the US Congress, if there is no agreement between the two chambers and with the Biden administration, Ukraine will have increasing difficulty in the next few weeks in holding the current front line. And here the question opens, what will the EU do in this situation? As we know, Europe, of course, has its problems in producing munitions and supplying them to Ukraine. However, it has the capacity to use the reserves of member states, transferring them to Ukraine, primarily when it comes to artillery munition. Europe has the ability to purchase ammunition and needed military equipment outside in third countries and transfer it to Kyiv. What weighs on the fate of this war is the case of political will and the willingness of member states to quickly assist Ukraine and replace all or part of the US supplies. However, what happens in Ukraine will also be important. So how is the morale of Ukrainian society after the second year?
Mam wrażenie, że przede wszystkim możemy mówić o gigantycznym zmęczeniu.
I have the impression that, first of all, we can talk about a huge fatigue, because this is the second year. There is also less positive news. As we recall the events on the front in 2022, That's when there was a lot of success on the Ukrainian side. First of all, Ukraine held out. Kyiv was not taken. Secondly, Russians withdrew there from those northern oblasts. There was a successful Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kharkiv Oblast and the recovery of some territories. The Russians then withdrew from the right bank of the Kherson region in November, and they left Kherson, the only regional city they had managed to take, and in fact that was the last major Ukrainian success. There have been no such major successes since. Moreover, the planned counter-offensive or Ukrainian offensive, which had very high expectations driven by the authorities and social media, traditional media, statements and so on, well, it clearly did not bring the results that were announced. This meant that the mood collapsed. That is, there is such an emerging feeling that this will indeed be a long-term war, that Russia is not that weak after all, that Russia is in fact learning from its mistakes, that it is capable of fighting for a long time, that it has a lot of reserves, perhaps more than Ukraine has. If we look at the results of opinion polls, there is no longer this great optimism concerning the end of the war. The vast majority of Ukrainian citizens recognize that the lack of independence, lack of sovereignty, being under Russian occupation, that this is an absolutely unacceptable situation. Russia is waging a war of attrition. As we can read in official statements from various Russian politicians, including at the highest level, we can read from there that the goal of this war is to destroy the country and destroy the Ukrainians as a nation. Therefore, the option of remaining under occupation and the loss of sovereignty is unacceptable. Nevertheless, somewhere in various studies we kind of see that this war will last a long time, and we also see that these territorial issues are still important. As much as 70-something% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine should not only defend the territory effectively controlled by Kyiv before the invasion, before February the 24th, 2022, but also reach the constitutional borders, namely Crimea and Donbass. This is over 70%. If opinion polls are to be believed, there is a growing percentage of Ukrainians who recognize that perhaps if some territorial concessions, but not political, this is an important caveat, that if they could accelerate the peace, then maybe that could be an idea. And this is at 12 to 13% of support. So this is where we see the dynamics.
So how might this war end? Could the third year be the last year of this conflict?
Niestety nic nie wskazuje na to, że to będzie ostatni rok wojny.
Unfortunately, there is no indication that this will be the last year of the war. From the very beginning, when the war broke out, it was clear that it would not end soon. We have on one side a determined Russia, the Putin regime, which wants to settle this armed conflict in its favor at all costs, and in recent months has actually begun to believe that this is possible again. On the other side, we have, of course, the Ukrainian side, which is determined to defend its sovereignty, but also its existence as a Ukrainian nation, at all costs. So unfortunately, there is no indication that this can end in the next months. It will probably continue for a long time to come.
Today, no one can say how long this war will last, but there is no doubt that these hostilities will continue. On the other hand, how long the war will last depends not only on whether there is enough determination on the Ukrainian side, because we can see that Ukrainians understand. They are very tired, but they understand that for them, this is an all-or-nothing war, for the to be or not to be of the Ukrainian state as an independent sovereign entity, but also for the very existence of the Ukrainian people.
On the other hand, it also depends on how the West continues to react. The Ukrainian army is fighting a defensive war, being in an increasingly difficult position, but at the same time, without further support from the West, the United States is crucial here. Well, it is clear that if this support is insufficient, if it is delayed, then this war will last longer. Putin and the Kremlin believes that this war has begun to develop advantageously for Russia, looking at the internal problems of the Ukrainian army, the lack of or late deliveries from the Western side, some problems on the Western side, the potential of Trump returning to the White House. All of this makes the Russians think that this war has finally started to go their way, which only deepens their certain determination to push harder. The Russian side has been the party with the initiative on the front for some time now, and the Russians are hoping that these Ukrainian Western problems will deepen, which will make Russia able to achieve these major goals of theirs. Will this happen? Not necessarily. It seems to me that here this war does not have to end in defeat for Ukraine. It can even end in victory for Ukraine. Today, this is probably an unpopular thesis, but I generally think that, assuming some favorable factors for Ukraine, that is, maintaining the public determination, which is probably the easiest thing to do, and with continued support of the West, at least maintaining Western support, then in the long term, there is a chance for Ukraine to be victorious in this war.
No to długoterminowo ta wojna ma szansę dla Ukrainy skończyć się sukcesem.